Right, let's start off with what was Paris. I don't know what all your backgrounds are. Did any of you go to Paris, not just the city, but to the COP? Okay, quite a few of you did. Okay, right. What was Paris? Well, it's an annual international negotiations on climate change, and this year was in Paris. And Paris has been the most important one since Copenhagen, and prior to that was Kyoto. So although we have them every year, they're punctuated by these particularly important annual events where the idea is you try to negotiate fairly sort of strong framework for the international community to deliver on climate change. Yeah, Copenhagen was the last one in 2009, which was a bit of a damp squib in the end, but some useful things came out of it. And prior to that was Kyoto. All countries prior to Paris, almost all countries, submitted carbon reduction pledges out to 2030. Now, these pledges only covered 2020 to 2030, and they weren't all about total reductions. Sometimes they were related to carbon intensity, there was related to how big your economy is. They'd use different sets of units. There's a bit of a sort of muddled fudge of the pledges, but nevertheless, they're useful. They give us some sort of handle about where we're heading. But remember, they only cover the period 2020 to 2030, so quite a short period. With assumptions around what happens after 2030, then they equate to about a temperature rise of 3 to 4 degrees C temperature increase by the end of the century. So if you add together the pledges and assume that they carry on the same sort of level of ambition after that, then it's about a 3 to 4 degrees C temperature rise. You'll hear people talk about it often as 2.7 degrees, but that's very optimistic about what happens after 2030. So 3 to 4 degrees. And the high CO2 Western countries, the UK being a prime example, have taken the view that 2 degrees C is the appropriate threshold between acceptable and dangerous climate change. But if you ask the poorer parts of the world, these are the low emitting parts of the world that are going to be hit by climate change, they would prefer a much, much lower target of 1 to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I think it's worth pointing out that at 2 degrees centigrade, though this is now it has been certainly since Copenhagen, a sort of the benchmark figure. At 2 degrees centigrade rise across the century, many people will die. They'll be poor, there'll be low emitters, so they won't be people that have caused the problem. They'll live a long way away from here, typically, and they'll also typically be non-white. So we know who will be hit by climate change, and many, many people will die as a consequence or will suffer very dire repercussions. So we have a very clear picture on what our actions are delivering to other parts of the world. So that's why they argue for 1 to 1.5 degrees C temperature rise. I mean, that's why the poor parts of the world are arguing for a much lower temperature increase. The role of Paris was really to address this huge gap between what came out to be the ambition or the desires going into Paris and where the pledges were pointing us towards. So there's between the sort of rhetoric and this reality. So that was the purpose of Paris. Now, I think it's also worth bearing in mind, before we ever sort of think about what we're going to do about the future, is to remind ourselves, where are we today? And we often aren't very honest about where we are now. So let's think where we are today in 2016. The first IPCC report on climate change came out over 25 years ago, which, I'm looking around here, that's longer than some of you have been alive. So for a quarter of a century, grey-haired or no-haired people have completely failed you and your future. So when you see people like me stood at the front, I should really start off with a very sincere apology that we are handing you this legacy. So a quarter of a century we've known about climate change, everything we needed to know to act, and we have actively chosen to do nothing. Worse than nothing, actually. The carbon dioxide emissions this year will be 60% higher than they were in 1990. So during our 25 years of concern for your futures, we've let our emissions go up, so they are 60% higher now. The atmospheric level of carbon dioxide is currently higher than it's been for about 800,000 years, and probably as much as 5 million years, but certainly 800,000 years, which is about 2 to 3 times longer than any of us, not any one individual, but as a species have been on the planet. So this is the backdrop to Paris, a backdrop of abject failure by people like us, the high emitters. So I think we should always sort of remember that before we start to think about where we're going to go in the future. Remind ourselves, where are we today and where have we come from? Crucially, Paris was very important on this front, and indeed the IPCC reports. The IPCC, do you know what they are? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're the main UN body that collate the science around climate change. The Paris Agreement and the IPCC make direct reference to 2 degrees centigrade, and particularly to this concept of carbon budgets. This is from the IPCC reports. Unfortunately, this was not finally included in the Paris Agreement. And that is very, very important sort of transition from the sorts of goals that we've had historically, where everyone is focused on this 2050 framework, We must do something by 2050, otherwise not in my term of office if you're a politician, or I'll be a retired academic, on a nice pension if you're a professor. So it's a time frame a long way in the future, and it has nothing to do with climate change, and it never has had anything to do with climate change. The only thing that matters in terms of temperature is the carbon budget. And the reason we like this is because this requires us to do nothing politically or in our own lives. The reason we don't like this one, even though it's scientifically legitimate, is it requires us to do something now and preferably yesterday. To simplify this, for a 2 degrees C temperature rise, or indeed for 1.5 degrees C temperature rise, what we have is a very clear carbon budget, the amount of carbon dioxide that we can spend or emit into the atmosphere over the century. There's a very high correlation between the temperature and how much we put out over this century. And we can think of this graphically. So here we have carbon dioxide on one side and years out the bottom. These are our emissions. This is during our period of concern here, going up. So it's a plot of our arrogance in some respects. It's also a plot of our carbon dioxide emissions. And we know that we have for a 2 degrees centigrade, we have a certain carbon budget. Can you see that from there? Yeah, okay. We have a certain carbon budget. That's the area under the curve. The first report came out, we've always chosen to delay action. Then we have to do something to remove the emissions from the system more rapidly in the future. And what that means is that the rate of mitigation, the rate of reducing our emissions, has to increase very significantly. So when we were first giving talks like this back in 2005, we were talking about reduction rates of 6, 7, 8, 9% per annum. And now we're talking reduction rates of well above 10%, probably nearer, really, the latest data, probably more nearer 13% or more. And I'll come back to that later on. So we have already delayed action very significantly. Let's go back to the Paris Agreement. I'm going to make a provocation here, and I'll read this out so I don't get it wrong. In providing guidance to policymakers in the run-up to Paris, we, and by that I mean the scientific and expert community, that includes the NGO communities, the engineers, the social scientists as well, we have applied questionable assumptions and fine-tuned our analysis to align with political and economic sensibilities. Now that's a deliberate provocation, so I'm pushing it a little bit far, but I think by and large, as a community, we have chosen to adjust our frameworks to fit with what is politically acceptable, with what the funders want to hear. So what George Osborne wants to hear, what we want to hear globally, what our VCs want to hear. And that, I don't think, is the job of academics. Now, we sometimes have done this, we've worked quite objectively, but within very subjective boundaries, but that is not good enough, in my view. And I'll try to pick this apart a little bit as we go through the presentation. But obviously, that's quite a criticism of our particular scientific community. And I'm going to start really, before I talk a bit more about Paris and then on to the budgets, with this quote from Richard Feynman, who was a really very eminent and really engaging physicist in the 20th century. If you've never read any work of Richard Feynman's or watched his videos, it's really worth looking at. Almost everything he writes is... Oh, I've flicked past it. So let's try and go back. Almost everything he writes is worth reading. This is taken from when he was the president, just before he died actually, of the space shuttle disaster, the Challenger. And he wrote this in his report there. Again, even reading the Challenger report is well worth looking at because Feynman was involved. For successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. And I'll try to show as I go through this, I think we have deliberately, as an academic community, as politicians, as a society in general, we have tried to fool nature. We have not tried to be honest about this from the beginning. We have followed the rules of public relations rather than those of academic credibility and integrity. This is the Paris Agreement. There were 3 versions of it mostly during the final week. So you had the first version, which is very long with lots of brackets, and the brackets cover, every country sort of has its red lines. Then during the week you get a second version, which is actually on the Friday, just before the final version, and that's got less brackets in it. And then you get the final version, which is much shorter, no more brackets, and a lot of the stuff that you hoped was in there is now gone, because they've had to compromise to get agreement. So this is the Paris Agreement, 32 pages long. And in many respects, I think on 2 very important respects, and a lot of people have suggested in lots of other respects as well, but 2 important respects, in my view, it was a real triumph. The first one is that the 190 leaders declared that they basically believed the climate science. They have pretty much pushed aside the climate skeptics. And actually, it's interesting to see how quiet the climate skeptics were in the run-up to Paris and since Paris. So I think, actually, that is really important. The integrity of the scientists working year in, year out, just doing the basic scientific work, not necessarily any of the policy-related stuff, has actually won out in the end. And I think that's a really important triumph to come out of Paris. And the second triumph relates to this particular paragraph here, which none of you can read, so I've blown it up. Have any of you read this exciting document? Well, a few of you, yes, and you're still awake. Yeah. It's not a riveting read, is it really? Certainly the first 16 pages. So to hold the increase in global average temperature well below 2 degrees C, notice that well below, not a 50-50 chance of, or like the UK government, a 63% chance of exceeding 2 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees C. It also has this part here, to undertake reductions in accordance with the best science, and I think probably the IPCC are as good an authority on that as you could really imagine. And that was not in the penultimate text, and quite a few of us were a little animated, to say the least, that any reference to science had been removed from 32 pages on climate change. But this bit was put back in. A lot of the other things we asked for were not put back in, but that was put in. And then also on the basis of equity and efforts to eradicate poverty. So the four important, and I think that really the three most important things here, well below 2 degrees C, 1.5 as well, but I'll come back to that later. I think it's less significant. Best science, and on the basis of equity. And with this effectively gives us a quantitative framework with which to hold our leaders to account. Now, whether that's our VCs, whether that's our governments, whether it's the EU Commission, whether it happens to be whatever organisation we're in, this gives us a framework within which we can hold people to account quantitatively. So actually, I think this part is very useful in the Paris Agreement. There were lots of issues I have with it. Firstly, it's an agreement about climate change, which I think has something to do with fossil fuels as far as I'm aware, but there's no reference to fossil fuels in 32 pages of the document, nor no reference to decarbonisation in the whole of the Paris Agreement, because you have to keep the Saudis on board. Yeah, everyone's got to be kept on board, so we just water down one thing after the other. Did any of you hear the discussions about should or shall in relation to the Americans? Yeah, I mean, the idea that, and that went on for a long time. Yeah, shall has legal repercussions, should doesn't. So aviation and shipping, this is equivalent to the emissions of the UK and Germany added together, are exempt, they're not covered. I don't know which country covers them now, God, presumably. No one else seems to be taking account for them. So they can now carry on increasing without any direct sort of guidance from the Paris Agreement. The voluntary pledges, as they were then called the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions, and now really the NDCs, because now we've gone beyond that intended side, they add up to about 3 to 4 degrees C, not this misleading 2.7 degrees that a lot of people have talked about. We're not going to review the INDCs, the pledges, till 2023. I think that's a long time from now. That's 300 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide that will be pumped into the atmosphere between now and when we review the INDCs. You know, that CO2 will be there. Some of that CO2, about 20%, will be there for up to 10,000 years, changing the climate. So we have chosen, despite the fact that pledges are far too weak, to do nothing about them till 2023. And the whole edifice is reliant on negative emission technologies, which I'm going to come back to quite a lot later on, to keep it all together. The idea that you can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at some point a long way in the future. So before Paris, we were heading in this direction, which is 4 to 6 degrees C sort of temperature rise. Now, you can't be too precise about these things, but that's the sort of direction we were heading before the Paris agreements. With the Paris agreements, we're heading more in this direction. I think probably, to be honest, thanks more to the economists or the financiers that clapped the global economic system. That was probably more why we're heading in this direction. But this is the pledges. Now, does it seem reasonable that we're going to carry on going up like the pledges suggest, either being static or the one we had before? Well, this is the UK. Just an example of the UK, a leading nation on climate change, question mark. This is what this leading nation on climate change is doing about it. We've given tax breaks to shale gas, which is made up of methane, which is principally methane, CH4, 75% of the mass of methane is carbon. So when you burn it, you get lots of carbon dioxide. We've recently reduced taxes on the oil industry to help it through these difficult times. And the Chancellor's proposed a whole suite of new gas-fired power stations without any carbon capture and storage. We had their highest ever investment in North Sea oil in 2012 and 13. We're expanding aviation and ports. We've systematically dismantled the support for renewables. We've reneged in the government's commitment in its manifesto on carbon capture and storage. And we've opened a consulate in Alberta next door to the tar sands, so we can sell our oil expertise into the dirt to help dig out the dirtiest fuel in the world. Makes coal look clean. And this is what a leading nation on climate change is doing. No one's any better than this, really. The Germans know better, the Norwegians know better. And we all have our little little honeypots of activity which are pointing in the right direction, but as a sort of systemic output for most countries, they're moving in this sort of direction. So I think we are certainly heading to this higher band here, but this is where we are signed up for. Remember, this is an outside chance of 2 degrees C. 1.5 will bring it down here, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So there's a huge gap. And to me, the big issue here, and this is the one that has huge political repercussions, is that in the near term, you cannot build your way out of this problem. Now, as an engineer who I should hasten to add, I spent 10 years building offshore oil platforms, so I have a background working in the oil industry. I think engineering can do a lot. It is possible to build wonderful power stations that are low carbon, but you cannot build them quickly enough. You cannot electrify the grid quickly enough to get you onto this curve. So we need deep cuts in energy demand. That has major political repercussions. The supply side is really important. It's essential. You've got to do something about low carbon supply. So, all of the options that are there for low carbon supply need to be put in place as quickly as possible. But it's not enough. And most of the time we focus on the supply side because I can notice that's in the future. And that means we haven't got to do anything. We can just rely on wind turbines and nuclear power stations in the future. And these curves here are based on just a global picture. So there's no concept here of equity. Yet equity is embedded within the Paris Agreement, indeed the Copenhagen Accord as well. So equity is an important part here, and you have to sort of tease that out. What does this mean for the richer and poorer parts of the world? But before looking at a bit of detail, I just want to go back to the carbon budgets in relation to 1.5 degrees C, because I'm going to be focusing mostly on 2 here. In 4 to 13 years from now, we will have put out so many emissions into the atmosphere that would have wiped out the budget for 1.5 degrees C. So why was it there? The pledges are not going to be reviewed till 2023. By that time, we've wiped out almost all of the chance for 1.5 degrees C temperature rise. In any real meaningful sense, it's too late for 1.5 degrees C. It was put in there, in many respects, as a sop to the poorer parts of the world, which I think was disingenuous, unreasonable thing to do, at best. So we're trying to keep them happy by putting this number in there, even though it's completely impossible to deliver in relation to the carbon budgets, unless you believe in sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere in the future, and so we will come back to that. So for 2 degrees C, a 66% chance of staying below 2 degrees C, in other words, a reasonable probability of it, is now gone. That's been blown. We won't be able to do anything about that in the time frame that we have. So that's gone. Now, you think about it, 2 degrees C, we've defined it, people like us, as the threshold between acceptable and dangerous. I'm sure none of you would ever fly, but if you did fly, would you ever accept that sort of chance of landing safely? 66% chance? I mean, it certainly would cut back on the number of people flying if they knew that was the odds. But you would never accept it. And yet that's only one flight with 400 people on it, or whatever it might be. We're talking about a planet here. So we have, even the best that we're prepared to accept is a low chance of staying below dangerous impacts on our planet. But that's gone. A 50-50 chance would require a warlike footing on climate change now. Do we have anything like that? In our own lives, in our own universities, in our own governments, nothing like that at all. There is no sense that climate change is an important or urgent issue. That one is gone as well. All we have a chance for now, and I'll give you the numbers behind this if you want to, we are now on the outside chance of 2 degrees centigrade. That's the best that we can really hope for, an outside chance of 2 degrees. Bearing in mind that many people will die at 2 degrees C. It will have major global repercussions, not just to people, but to ecosystems as well. So this will be quite a different world at 2 degrees. So what's this mean for richer and poorer countries? Well, it's quite easy. You don't require an integrated assessment model or a large computer. You just require a bit of pen and paper or a calculator, some basic arithmetic. We have a global carbon budget for 33% chance of 2 degrees C. There's a bit of a range in the IPCC, so you can use that range. We can make some sort of estimate as to what could the poorer parts of the world do if we imagine them doing everything they could towards climate change. What would their carbon budget look like? What would the amount of carbon dioxide they emitted look like over the century? We can make some guess as to what that might be, and we can adjust that. And then we can subtract 2 from 1, and that tells us what's left for us, what's left for the UK, for Sheffield, for the richer parts of the world. And that tells us something about the scale of the challenge. So just basic arithmetic. Let's imagine the poorer parts of the world peaked their emissions by 2025. In Paris, China said it would peak emissions by 2030, India 2040, and other countries later than that. Now, although they said that, I think it's very likely they can reduce their emissions much more rapidly than they're suggesting in Paris, and I think a 2025 peak remains doable, basically because the poorer parts of the world are dominated by the emissions from China. So I think China can do it, is already doing a lot, and certainly 2025 looks to be quite a viable time frame. And then let's imagine it starts to mitigate and manages to achieve 10% per annum. Mitigates is a posh word for reduce our emissions. To reduce our emissions by 10% per annum by 2025. Imagine that if you've got a growing economy of 3% per annum, that's a reduction or improvement in carbon intensity of 13% every single year. That's a huge requirement. That's 3 times faster than people like Stern and most other economists would suggest is possible with economic growth, which of course we have to have. Apparently it's essential, much more than physics. That would mean they have to fully decarbonise their energy system, not their electricity system, their energy system, everything, planes, cars, fridges, the whole lot, by 2050. And we can work out the carbon budget for that quite easily. It's just about a bit of arithmetic, a few curves. And we can subtract that from the carbon budget for 2 degrees C, and then we can work out what's left for us. For people like us, and we're revisiting this now with the latest budget, so we think, in fact, it's going to be higher, nearer 13%, or maybe even a little bit higher from this. But at least a 10% per annum reduction in emissions every single year. Now, if you think about that, how does that play out? That's a 50% reduction by 2020. So we talked about 43% for the university and for other universities by 2020. So that's sort of, broadly in the right sort of direction. But this is across all of your emissions. Like the 43%, I don't think includes scope 3. So, students flying backwards, international students flying backwards and forwards, lecturers whizzing off to fancy conferences in exotic locations. None of that's counted. Procurement's not counted. All of that would also need to be counted in your 50% reduction. 75% reduction by 2025, 90% reduction by 2030, and for the wealthy parts of the world, we would have to be fully decarbonised by 2035. Now, we'd all shake our heads, they say that's not possible. But when we say it's not possible, we say it's okay for other poor people to die elsewhere. There isn't a way out of this. Whatever we don't do, others will suffer the impacts. So there isn't a nice, comfortable situation to deal with here. Well, what we face is a radically different future either way. Submission to Paris from the EU and the wealthiest parts of the world was for a 40% reduction by 2030, less than half of what we would need to do to deliver an outside chance of 2 degrees centigrade. Now, how can this be reconciled with sort of statements like this? This is from the working group 3 of the IPCC. That's the sort of economics section of the IPCC. The working group 1 is the main science section. Working group 3, mostly economists, or many economists. Global economic growth would not be strongly affected by making the reductions necessary for 2 degrees C. Now, there's no way that you're going to reduce at 10% per annum without affecting global economic growth. For the UK, we get from the Committee on Climate Change, the good news is that 2 degrees C reductions are possible without sacrificing the benefits of economic growth and rising prosperity. That keeps everyone happy, doesn't it? And there's no way you can reconcile those positions. And the people writing this are fully aware of that, but they're also fully aware if they don't say that, their funding is stripped. And that's not just true at the Committee on Climate Change. Just look at the strategy documents for all of the research councils. It's basically something that George Osborne's written. And we are no longer are we at an arm's length in terms of academics or the research councils from government. There's barely a cigarette paper between what government wants and what the research councils are now funding. And I think that's a disgrace, but if you say that, if you say that, it's harder to get funding for a start. There are 2 rabbits in the hat here. The first one of these is about negative emissions. How can we reconcile these 2 positions? The first one we are assuming is that negative emission technologies will work. And they're principally, the one that's mostly considered in the integrated assessment models that are used to advise governments, is BECCS, which is biomass, energy, carbon capture and storage. And basically here you grow trees or plants, miscanthus, switchgrass, whatever it might be. As they grow, they suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. You then chop them down and pelletize them, put them on ships and transport them all around the world to the world's power stations. You burn them in the power stations. You capture the CO2 as it goes up the chimney. You almost liquefy the CO2 on a phase change state. And then you pump it underground and you store it there for a few thousand years. Well, that sounds quite reasonable, doesn't it? This has never worked at scale. BECCS has never worked at scale. There are huge technical and economic unknowns. There are major efficiency penalties. A normal power station, a coal-fired or gas-fired power station, will be an efficiency of between 35 and 55%. That's how much the energy will be converted into useful output. You bolt this on the end of it, you're taking out another 15 to 25%. So it's very, very inefficient. Limited biomass availability. We also want biomass for food, to feed 9 billion people. The aviation sector thinks it's going to fly its planes on biomass. The shipping sector thinks it's going to be using biomass for its ships. We already use 5 to 7% of biomass in our car fuel. and the chemical industry thinks it can use biomass as a feedstock, and we live in a round planet. You sort of think, well, can we produce that much biomass? And you have to have your fingers crossed on feedbacks. So whilst we use this method as a form of procrastination, so we don't have to do anything in the meantime, we have to have your fingers crossed that things like the permafrost won't keep melting, you won't get ongoing increases in methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, so you won't get a whole suite of feedbacks. So you have to be fairly lucky on the feedbacks as well. The scale that is included in these things called integrated assessment models, these are the models, as I say, that primarily are used to advise governments, is planting out an area of 1 to 3 times the size of India. Now, if you're British, you'll think it will be India because we're quite colonial. But we're just saying that it's an area like that. Year after year, decade after decade, and store hundreds of billions of carbon dioxide securely underground somewhere for thousands of years. That's what we are relying on, rather than actually reducing our emissions today. And the other thing we're relying on here, which makes this one look quite reasonable, we're going to peak global emissions in the past, which sounds quite flippant. Obviously, Doctor Who's managed it, but no one else has. But actually, is that true? Are we seriously basing policy on those two? I mean, it's hard to believe that's the case. This is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenario database. There are 400 scenarios in their database for a 50% chance or better of 2 degrees centigrade. 86% of them include negative emission technologies. The other 14% all assume we peak in 2010. And many, in fact, I think it's most of the scenarios assume that we both peak in 2010 or thereabouts and have negative emissions. Now, the UK government's position is based on the UNEP GAP report, United Nations Environment Programme GAP report, and that's something, again, very similar to this. Most of the scenarios in that report, I think it's about, there are 163 scenarios, and 140 of the scenarios assume we peak emissions globally in 2010, there or thereabouts. So, it is unrealistic, obviously, to think we can go back in time to peak global emissions. So rather than focus on urgent and deep mitigation, Paris, some academics, politicians, many of us actually, we're going to, we don't want to do deep and urgent mitigation today because it has huge and challenging economic, social repercussions for how we have to live our lives. So rather than do that, we're going to rely on non-existent negative emission technologies in 2040, 2050 and beyond to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere in huge quantities. So that's what we're relying on. We're ignoring, when you think about this, we're ignoring the real risk of positive feedbacks. So we're ignoring the fact that we know there are a whole suite of positive feedbacks that will make the situation worse if we don't do something about stopping a rise in temperature very soon. And they make things harder. They reduce the size of the carbon budgets, these feedbacks. Now, we know they are there, but we're ignoring those. And at the same time, we are prepared to accept the huge risk that these negative emission technologies will not work at scale. So we have completely sort of adopted an approach of naive optimism, towards some sort of techno-utopian future. So the science tells us very clearly about these things up here, these feedbacks. And the social science and some of the other science and engineering tell us this looks risky. And yet we'll still prefer this one over thinking about those sets of issues. So at every level, we as a community have erred on the side of significant optimism. So I go back to Richard Feynman and make the point, what are we doing? Are we trying to fool nature? Do you think that's what we're doing? Peaking emissions in the past, requiring time machines, and requiring to suck out of the atmosphere hundreds of billions of tons of CO2. That's more, of course, than we produce in all other forms of waste. We produce more in terms of carbon dioxide of tons of waste than any other form of waste, and store it for a few thousand years underground securely somewhere. So I think Feynman had a point there. I mean, it's about time that we listen to nature and the second law of thermodynamics and not worry too much about what the economists have said. Physics has a 13 billion year history, while the current economic model is simply an ephemeral construct. And yet, almost all of our independent academic lives, including as science, is influenced by that ephemeral construct. So we may work subjectively, objectively, but we are working often in quite subjective boundaries. So why have we, as the academic community, why have we become beholden to the latter? Why do we not speak out against the latter? And obviously some people do. So we turn into 2 degrees C. Is it still a viable goal? My hypothesis is yes. So there's I'm quite upbeat now about we can do something about this. We're only talking about an outside chance of 2 degrees centigrade. And there are 3 things I'm going to touch on. One I'm not going to go into in any detail. The first one is on equity and behaviour. So I think it's really important. The second one is on technology. As an engineer, you've got to have technology in there somewhere. And the third one was on growth, but I've sort of grayed that out a little bit. I'm not going to talk about growth, but you can probably get some sort of sense of my concern that the the economists have taken over, and that we're part science as a result. But we can discuss that in the panel perhaps. So let's go to equity first. This is a useful set of figures. I've been using some other data based on Vilfredo Pareto, who was a 19th century Italian economist, but thankfully now Chancel and Lucas Chancel and Piketty, some of you may have heard of Piketty, quite well-known economist, French economist, have pulled some data together, along with a new report recently from Oxfam that shows how emissions are skewed to particular groups of people. 50% of global emissions come from 10% of the population. Top 1% of US emitters which is about 3.5 million people, have carbon footprints that are 2,500 times greater than the bottom 1% globally. But emissions are hugely skewed to a few people. But that's actually much easier from a policy perspective. We have to have policies that aim at that group. So who are in this high emitting group? If we can understand who's in that group, we can start to have policies aimed at them, rather than having to say the policy has to affect everyone on the planet, which is much more challenging. Climate scientists. You very seldom see a climate scientist that's on the ground. They're normally on a flight somewhere. So their carbon footprints are very high indeed. If you're an OECD academic, pretty much guaranteed. If you're an academic almost anywhere in the world, you're probably in that top few percent of emitters. And if you're a student, you're desperately aspiring to be there. Anyone who takes a long-haul flight every year or so, that generally is a very good way of saying, are you in the high emissions group? The flight will help, but with the other ways that we live our lives, people that fly a lot, particularly if you're a frequent flyer, you're definitely well into that group, probably in the 1% or even higher. 2 degrees centigrade is a short-term challenge for 2 degrees centigrade. I'm quite careful about that, 2 degrees C. It's a consumption problem, not a population problem. This red herring that is about the poor becoming wealthy is meaningless. Just do the basic maths. The poor will not become wealthy enough in the time frame we have to deal with 2 degrees centigrade for their emissions to really matter. What matters in terms of emissions are the people who consume today. Now, that's not just people in the West. That also includes about 300 million people in China who consume like the average European. Now, there's another billion people that don't. So these people are spread all around the world. But we know who they are, and we know, there are policies that we could put in place to reduce that particular group's emissions. If the top 10% of emitters reduced their emissions to the carbon footprint of the average European, now that's not asking too much, is it really? The top 10% would have, if you thought climate change was a serious issue, the top 10% reduce their emissions to the average level of, to the level of an average European. That's not really impoverished. That would be a 33% reduction in global emissions. If you thought climate change was serious, is that really hard to expect for the short period or the 20 or so years it will take us to put low carbon energy supply in place, to ask this particular group, people like us I suppose, ask this group to reduce our emissions to the level of the average European? Is that too much to ask? That would give us a 33% reduction. Not enough, but it certainly moves us in the right direction. Some very brutal logic to carbon budgets, and if you can find a way around this, I'd be pleased to know what it is, because this makes my life quite difficult. Just look at aviation. For every ton of CO2 we emit when we fly, or indeed from any other high carbon activity, is a ton of CO2 for a given carbon budget that a poorer person cannot emit for a given carbon budget. And in the short term, what we know very clearly is for the poor people around the planet to have access to fossil fuels improves the quality of their life. Thanks. There are a whole suite of academic studies that have shown this. That initially, as our consumption of fuel energy goes up, and fossil fuels mostly goes up, our quality of life improves, and then we keep consuming more and more, then it flattens off. So let's go to technology. Let's talk something a bit more upbeat. What can we do with technology? There's a huge amount that can be done on the demand side. And I'm going to just touch on two of these as examples. The first one, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't move to public transport or we shouldn't cycle or try and travel less. All of those things are really important. All I tried to look at here was what can you do with the existing infrastructure and paradigm if you assume no change in driving habits. So let's look at the first one of those. Private road use cars, basically, in the EU and US is somewhere between 12 and 15% of our CO2 emissions. There are now over 300 models of cars, of petrol and diesel cars, not electric cars, that have emissions per kilometre of less than 100 grams. Now, it could be, I heard yesterday, is that Mitsubishi just admitted they've been fiddling their data for the last 25 years in the cars they're selling. But certainly, 100 grams is quite doable, even if you allow for the fiddled data. Quite a few of them are down at the 85 gram mark. So 100 grams. What's the average car in the UK? About 165 grams of carbon dioxide. The average new one being bought is probably about 135 grams. The average American car is 220 grams. So, you know, these are available now. And what's important, at no price premium. They take 3 seats in the back for your kids if you want to have kids in your car. You know, they're as big as any other car. They all do the speed limit. They'll all do probably 100 miles an hour, probably, if you want them to. So they do everything else a normal car can do. They look like a normal car. They fill up with petrol like a normal car. Another great thing is that 2/3 of all vehicle kilometres are travelled by cars that are 8 years old or younger. So there's a very rapid turnaround of cars in the market. So if you put in a maximum CO2 standard of, say, 100 grams and then tighten that to, say, 7% every year, at no additional capital cost, because we're not asking people to change their cars more regularly, you could have a scrappage scheme and increase that. But in this case, at no additional capital cost, reduced operating cost, less fuel, identical infrastructure, same roads, same petrol stations, same employment, because same companies. The companies that make the efficient cars also make the inefficient cars. So there's no change in employment here. You'd have a 50 to 70% reduction in 10 years. All you require are politicians with spines and a public that's prepared to back them and ignore what Clarks and Top Gear and those other ecological Luddites tell us. So that's possible now with existing technologies at no price premium. And we can't even be bothered to do that. Same thing for refrigeration. I won't go through this one here, but an A+ refrigerator, according to DEC, uses 80% less energy than an A-rated refrigerator. That's the same size. That's not different ones. For the same size refrigerator, 80% less. So why are we selling A-rated refrigerators? Why not just have a standard that is the same level as that, and it gets tightened every year? The Japanese did this years ago, called the Top Runner program, for quite a suite of appliances. So it's not as if this is a new way of doing it. If you did that, then you'd have something like there or thereabouts, a 50% reduction in refrigeration load over 50 years. Now, there are a whole suite of things about rebound effect, Jevons paradox, that the money we would save, we would spend on jet skis or more holidays, which are important, and I think there are things you can do about them. I'm not going to go into them now, but there are a suite of things you can do about those as well. And just think about this across the electricity system. If you need a fridge to keep your lettuce cold or your beer or whatever it happens to be, you need electricity, you need a transmission network, you need power stations, and you need someone in Qatar to get the gas out of the ground or the Australians to get the coal out of the ground. You start to put some units on this, 10 units of useful refrigeration. In an A-rated fridge would require us, because they're very inefficient, to put in 50 units of useful energy, electricity. You'd lose about 6 to 8% in the transmission and distribution lines. That's mostly in the distribution, the low voltage stuff in the cities. The pylons overhead are pretty efficient, about 2% loss. Power stations run at 35 to 55% efficient, and you lose at least 10% getting the stuff out of the ground, putting it on ships and transporting it right around the planet. So if you save 1 unit here, you save 13 units there, and yet we spend all our time focusing on this. Now this is important, but then so is this. And this takes a long time to deliver. This one's much, much quicker. So we should not move away from the supply side, but we should double or triple our effort on the demand side. So for 2 degrees C, I think if we're serious about it, there are 2 phases to delivering it. First, we need deep reductions in energy demand by the high emitters of the planet, and we know who they are, and we know what sort of scale reductions we're looking at. And the second one, we need a Marshall-style plan, a bit like the reconstruction after the Second World War, of moving towards zero carbon, not low carbon, zero carbon energy. You know, initially it can be very low carbon. We have to get the emissions down to virtually zero, otherwise the temperature will keep going up. Because there will always be emissions from the agricultural sector particularly, and probably some emissions, at least initially, from the process sector, from the process emissions from some things like steel and cement, for instance. So we need to be zero carbon from energy. And we need to do that across the globe with 100% penetration by 2050 to give us an outside chance of 2 degrees C, at which, anyway, a lot of people will die. And this is the best that we now have, because for 25 years, people like me have chosen to do nothing. So let's give a bit more of a flavour as what we could deliver. What would this mean for demand? These are just some pointers on this. 75% of homes, roughly, will still be here in 2050. Okay. If we retrofitted those, we'd have low-energy houses with low CO2 emissions. And retrofitting these with a deep retrofit, not passive house, about £40,000 per house. So quite expensive. But those houses would then also be resilient to a changing climate. These houses will be there for the next 50, 60, 100 years, possibly. This eliminates fuel poverty, which is about 10 to 20% of all houses in the UK. 26 million homes in the UK, for instance, of which 10 to 20% are in fuel poverty. And it also makes all of us resilient to changing prices, the volatility of fuel prices. So this is really a good thing. And it costs us less than 2% of GDP. And the other great thing about it is it's great for training and employment. You do not have to be skilled to do retrofit. you will get trained up, and as long as you've got your foreman or forewomen and your inspectors and so forth are up to the job, they can ensure that people do a good job of retrofit. It's not easy doing retrofit to do it well, but it's quite possible. So this is one of those few occasions, I think, where there are many win-win-wins here. You're talking about 60 to 70% reductions in carbon emissions and energy use within the households with a full-on retrofit. We should have a maximum CO2 standard for all new cars and also rapidly move towards electrification or something along those sort of lines. Stringent efficiency standards on all equipment, and that could be led by governments or indeed by universities. So it would only have a top runner program for the universities. It will only buy things that are the top end of the efficiency range. Major behavioural changes for high emitters, high energy users. So these are the sort of demand things that we need to be trying to do. And I think if we did all of that, we could power down our energy consumption by between 40 and 70%. That's a huge reduction. But if we can do that and do the supply side, then we can hit 2 degrees C. I think that is viable and doable, even if it's very, very challenging. What's this mean for supply? A massive electrification program. Currently, only 20% of the energy we consume is electricity. 80% of what we consume is not electricity. And we have to make heating and transport, probably much of the energy that's used in industry as well. We have to make that electricity because you can make electricity at make it very low carbon. It's very hard to imagine what else you use that's not electricity that is low carbon. Some biofuel, perhaps, some bioenergy, perhaps some hydrogen, but that's likely to be produced from electricity anyway. So you have to really electrify the system. Maybe 80% of the energy needs to be electric, not just 20%. Smart grids, intelligent metering and community energy, these help with issues of engagement, but also with issues of intermittency, which is an important issue, but exaggerated by many people as to how important it is. We have to sustainably exploit all the huge renewable potential that we have. There's massive potential in the UK. And some of that will have, when I say sustainably, we have to think about that, because I personally would go for the 7 barrage, which is probably 6 to 7 gigawatts of energy. So the equivalent probably output over a year of something like 2.5 to 3.5 nuclear power stations. Now, it will have lots of local sustainability implications, but I think it's worth that for the climate change benefits. But yeah, there are arguments that we can all have. UK solar panels, if you fitted them on all roofs around, southwest-facing roofs around the UK, that would generate 1/3 of UK's electricity. Solar panels on the southwest-facing roofs of domestic properties, 1/3 of electricity in a country like ours, which is not, as you can spot today, not the sunniest place in the world. So there are huge things you can do across the board. Indigenous biomass and biogas to help with some of the intermittency issues. So that's some arguments on the supply side. And the policy side, progressive metering tariffs. Basically, that means that as you use more energy, you pay more per unit. At the moment, the people who pay most per unit are the poorest in our society. If you're rented accommodation and you've got one of those card meters or anything like that, then you're paying more per unit than people like me at the lower end. So we should switch that round. So the more you consume, the more you pay per unit. Adopt a low discount rate for the economists that happen to be here. 3.5% is the Green Book rate from the Treasury. That makes a massive difference. It makes wind turbines onshore at 3.5% are much cheaper than gas. Wind turbines onshore at 10% discount rate are more expensive than gas. So the discount rate, that's why costs are not an objective function. They're not like gravity or anything like that. You know, costs are what you want to make them. You just choose a discount rate and you can get the cost to be anything. A moratorium on all new hydrocarbon developments and rapid reskilling of people who work in the oil industry and the technical industries supporting the oil industry to be doing renewables. Now, these people are highly skilled. They could quite easily be building offshore wind turbines off the continental shelf or wherever it might be. You know, they can be doing lots of things to moving towards renewable energy instead of producing oil. A moratorium on airport expansion. Quite unpopular, but so there's some policy options as well. I'm going to finish off with this final slide. This is what I always use. This is from Robert Unger. Used to be a Brazilian politician, but now he's much more of a philosopher. And at every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And that's our job in universities. That's what we're paid for, to have clarity and imagination, to think of how the future will be different, and then provide the policymakers with some clear vision of how you would get there, what that would look like, what are the numbers, what are the technologies, what are the policies, how will people respond, you know, all of that side of things. That's the job of us as academics. Imagination and clarity. We've been lacking both of those in relation to climate change for at least 25 years. So on that final note, thanks very much for listening.